Lord Seventh,
is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 6. The Nanjiang Chaminette. When the carriage entered the capital city's gates, Wuxia couldn't help but sneakily lift up its curtain. The entire journey going from Nanjiang to the Central Plains took several months. Only then did he know that this legendary place had actually turned out be such a large area, with so many people in it. The city walls were all interconnected, the traffic was endless, and the road was so long it was as if its end could never be reached in one's lifetime. Those Nanjiang jungles permeated by fog and miasma with no daylight to be seen all year round, as well as that stronghold braced within a large mountain, seemed to be so insignificant and even a bit shoddy in the presence of great rivers and ranges that stretched on continuously for an infinite amount of li. What area, then, had enticed the Central Plains men's army, for them to insist upon attacking their clan? Wuxia had asked the great shaman, as he was the most powerful and most wise person in the tribe, and the words he spoke were representative of the will of the deity Gaz. Wuxia would also be a great shaman in the future, but he was still a child, and there were yet many things he didn't understand. This is a test from Gaz, the great shaman told him. Gaz is omnipresent, looking at everything everyone does from another realm. The reason for this is buried today, but its fruits will be harvested in the future. It's merely that mortals' lives are too brief, and therefore, just like small bugs that die soon after they come out of the ground, they are witless, and do not comprehend divine will. When you grow up, when you meet many, many people and know of many, many things, only then will you faintly come to understand some of it. As the great shaman said this, the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes rose up, the look in his eyes serene as he gazed at the misty mountains in the distance, as well as pitch black, as if it was a pool of unmoving, still water. Wuxia looked at his eyes, then suddenly felt unusually down. The great shaman pat his head. You are already 10, and are starting to have your own thoughts and opinions. There are very many things that if I teach you them, you may not remember them for certain, and it's time I ought to have you go out and view them for yourself. Wuxia reached out and firmly clutched the other's long robes, lips pursed tight as he said nothing. The great shaman sighed. The Central Plains are a snare-like area, having vitality and wealth you couldn't imagine, the best-looking people, and the most refined objects. You may also think that, compared to the Central Plains, Nanjiang is a lousy, backwards place cut off from the world by mountains. You will be reluctant to leave it, and will forget who you are. I won't. Wuxia raised his head to look at him, lifting one fair-skinned little hand with seriousness. I vow to the deity that I will definitely come back, and never forget my clansmen all my life. I will bring my people to strike back, I will remember who's bullied us, and I will make them all die awful deaths. The great shaman smiled. His smiling look was unlike that of a godly envoy looking down from up on high, nor was it like a leader that did exactly what he said he would, but exactly like that of an ordinary elder, carrying some kindness and tiredness as he looked at the child that was growing day by day with an unspeakable hope, yet, because that hope was too solicitous, it also gave rise to worry. Remember the words you've said today, remember your homeland, and, regardless of how far away you go, remember that your clansmen will still be waiting for you. The Central Plains had Wuxia dazzled. Curious on the inside, he was always wishing that he could grow more than one pair of eyes to take a detailed look whenever they were passing through an area. Yet within that curiosity was a mixed-in portion of anxiety, and every single day before he slept, he would silently recite once through the words the great shaman had said to him prior to his departure. There were so many places, but not a one of them was as flourishing as the capital was, its prosperity making him feel surreal. Through the opened carriage curtain, a waft of a particular odor pounced at his face. He carefully identified it as the smell produced by humans and carriages rubbing shoulders in close proximity, very viscous, with a very, very diluted fragrance mingled therein, bearing something similar to allurement. He lifted his head. Both sides of the street were filled with people standing, some carrying bird cages, some hauling baskets, and all eagerly following their troop with their eyes, as if they were circling around to observe some kind of strange animal. The carriage slowly steadied out, traversing over the flat, large blocks of a bluestone road. A winding river also passed through the middle of the city, with several especially large, especially ostentatious boats quietly moored atop it, and the gentle babbling sound of rushing water passing by. Willows on the riverbank hung strips of paper down as if they were ever about to extend before his eyes, yet when he reached out to catch them, he couldn't. At this moment, the carriage came to a halt, the sound of someone's footsteps drawing near. Wuxia let down the curtain and sat up straight. The coach door was opened from the front side, and he saw his accompanying clansman ashenly posturing exactly as he was, standing to the side with an exceptionally straight back like he was trying hard to make himself look somewhat taller. Behind him was an old man with smiles heaped across his face, who wore a strange, tall hat, and had wide sleeves that hung all the way down next to his knees, his hands covered up within them. A sharp, thin voice came out of his mouth. "Oh, is this not Sir Chaminette? This arbitrary one greets you." The accompanying Liu Beiyuan quickly used the Nanjiang barbarian dialect to explain things to him. "This is eunuch Shi. He serves the emperor and is a first-class luminary. The emperor specially sent him to welcome you outside Bestowed Fortune Gate, and is also going to set up a banquet in the palace to welcome you from your far-off travels. This is an immense honor." Liu Beiyuan was a Han from the border of Nanjiang, and one of the guides Fen Yuanji had collected when he went to war. He was very fluent in both Mandarin and Barbarese, as well as quick-wit enough to climb upwards, drifting along into becoming a half-celebrity in the army. Their group of Nanjiang visitors were all limited to simple conversations in Mandarin, and would half understand, half not with any bit more of added complication, so he was specifically appointed to come be the shamanette's translator. Wuxi's face was covered by black cloth, revealing only a pair of extremely dark eyes that swept over Liu Beiyuan. The smile on the latter's face stiffened as he got the overall sense that the child's eyes were unlike a child's. So dark, so feral, and cut from the same mold that unreasonable, not yet dead shaman was, his appearance as he looked on coldly always made a chill blow in one's heart. Wuxia unhurriedly stood up. Liu Beiyuan ingratiatingly reached out a hand to help him up, then got it slapped away by Ashenly. Enraged, Liu Beiyuan turned his head around, but he caught sight of the fierce southerner glaring at him lividly. The brightly tinted tattoos exposed on his naked upper body made the young warrior appear to be somewhat malicious, and in the span of a second, Liu Beiyuan's fury cooled down in his gut. He timidly withdrew to the side, watching as Ashenly bent over and used an extraordinarily humble gesture to allow Wuxia to grab his forearm, carefully helping him disembark. The boy raised his eyes, saw the sharp-voiced, sharp-aured eunuch Shi, and hesitated. Recalling that the great shaman had warned him to restrain himself when he arrived in the Central Plains, as it was for the purpose of safeguarding all the people in their clan, he thus eventually slightly bowed his head. Eunuch Shi immediately turned to the side, expressing that he didn't dare to receive the courtesy. "This old slave is quite undeserving, and would never dare accept that. The imperial city was at the core of the capital, its halls connected upon other halls, with just a tad of inattention, one would get lost within such dazzling splendor. It all looked like it was gathering straight into the clouds. Wuxia looked upwards, thinking to himself, that's really high up. He was a bit scared, but he couldn't let that show, because Ashenli and the rest were behind him, and those enemy soldiers were watching him. He couldn't lose the clan's reputation. Quietly taking in a deep breath, he straightened out his clothes, then walked with eunuch Shi to its interior. When the Nanjiang warriors arrived at the Great Hall, all the officials that were whispering into each other's ears quieted down, and they watched as the squadron of southern barbarians entered in an intimidating formation. Year-round life on the plains had made their shoulders appear to be unusually broad, and atop every man's were totem-like tattoos, their honey-colored skin exposed to the outside world with their hair flying loose. Jing-Chi had received Emperor Helian Pei's favor and was sat at that great Buddha's side, currently taking advantage of no one paying attention to him to secretly have a yawn. He was only halfway through it when he heard the report, thus he stifled it back in and used all of his energy to blink away the tears that had surfaced in his eyes. He dimly remembered that in his last lifetime, he had only heard that the southern barbarians had bowed their heads and declared themselves servants, which satisfied the emperor's vanity. There were no other stupid ideas, nor was there any occurrence of a hostage entering the capital. Some things were different in this rebirth, indeed. Unable to tamp down a bit of curiosity, he gazed off into the distance, wanting to see what the valiant barbarians that made the great Qing lose 400,000 elite troops ultimately looked like. However, he glimpsed a child that was being escorted by those warriors. His tiny body was wrapped in crow-black robes, even his face unseen aside from an uncovered pair of eyes, giving him an eerie, evil aura. With a very straight back, he hardly seemed to be afraid of receiving everyone's measuring gazes. Jing-Chi wasn't sure why, but he felt the kid to be kind of pitiful. The great Qing's military officials knelt down, shouting "Long live the Emperor!" The barbarian warriors glanced at each other, then also uniformly knelt. Only the black-robed Chaminette still stood there, looking isolated. Minister Jian of Rites scowled and furrowed his brows, heavily clearing his throat. "How daring," he said angrily. "Thou lot hast already declared servitude to our great Qing and ought to take the Sacred One as your superior. Since you have met the Lord Father, you should then perform the standard rite of kneeling 3 times and kowtowing 9 times. For what reason do you not kneel? Great Qing's Emperor, we were defeated. To you, stating we're subjects, and kneeling down, are a must," Ashenli called out. "But the Chaminette is the future great shaman, envoy of Gez. He kneels to no one." Ashenli had a very large windpipe, so once that came out of his throat, his voice reverberated throughout the entire great hall. Jing-Chi narrowed his eyes and looked over. The guy looked beefy, but from listening to the voice he was speaking with, he might have still been a boy. He had a quite bullish energy, like a newborn calf that hadn't yet learned to fear tigers. Minister Jian's face went cold, his eyes glaring and beard puffing out in anger. "Mine emperor is the son of heaven and supreme ruler as truthfully ordained. Your little barbaric border god couldn't act rashly even if they descended here in person, let alone a 3 chi tall child with some title placed on his head." Ashenli glared at him with 2 eyes like copper hills, but Minister Jian was not the sort of unpresentable trash that Liu Beiyuan was. Though the old man posed like a decorated scholar too feeble to resist even the wind, and though he was the most particular about being well behaved in the Ministry of Rites, he was truly a stubborn old donkey. There were 2 things he was the best at in life, one was scolding people, and the other was to glare harder than the person he'd finished scolding, where even Helian Pei was somewhat avoidant of him. With Ashenly, it was one old and one young, big eyes glaring at little eyes, neither would back down to the other. Jing Qi slightly lowered his head, pressing down the corners of his mouth that were picking up. However, Wuxia suddenly extended his hand and pressed it down on Ashenly's shoulder. Soon after, he came forward a step, then knelt in a proper fashion. Wuxia, Nanjiang's Shaminet, pays respect to your majesty, Emperor of Great Qing. His voice hadn't yet changed, but it was crisp and bright, not bearing even a bit of immaturity. Both of his hands were placed on the ground, displaying somewhat pallid fingers, following which he stooped over and deferentially knocked his head against the ground once. Jing Qi took note that each of the fists of the warriors by the other's side were tightly clenched in that moment, and the young guy that had just challenged Minister Jian looked like he'd been hit by frost, his eyes completely red around the rims. Helian Pei Tsked, waving his hand. All of you, stand up straight now. He then turned his head to glare a bit at Minister Jian. Why, good subject Jian, haven't we said to you that my great Qing is a heavenly dynasty and higher nation, and thus should have an amount of tolerance for people? He is a child who has come from distant lands, and how old is he, even? What are you doing making things difficult for him? Someone come and give the Shaminet a seat. The man waited until the one in question had knelt and kowtowed before he reproached the old minister, having the latter wholly transform into the villain while nicely establishing himself as compassionate. Jing Qi considered his emperor to be truly without match. He also noticed the dolt emperor faintly leaning his form forward, sizing up the little Shaminet with a childlike curiosity. Shaminet, he opened his mouth to question, we ask you, since you're called so, do you have any exceptional abilities? There was sudden quiet in the great hall. Their stately supreme ruler was receiving subjects that had accepted surrender, and his first sentence was neither appeasing, nor menacing, nor even prioritizing the great Qing's prestige by expressing that the other party's loss was not an injustice and that they should be obedient from then on, but rather asking him, before anything else, whether he had techniques for passing through walls and such. The emotions of very many people were probably more or less the same as Jing Qi's, wanting to use their long sleeves to cover up their faces and pretend they didn't exist. Or, they were like old Minister Jian, saying nothing, but tweaking their mustache up bit by bit, about to pull it out on the spot. End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.